Hey guys, this is Tauna, and today we're going to be talking about a guide to the Counter Blitz Commander Precon. So this is going to be covering a whole bunch of different things. We'll get into what it covers in a minute, but this is a upcoming pre-constructed deck that is designed to easily allow you to jump into a game of Commander. It's going to be a bracket 2, which is roughly the power level of all Precons, and it's going to be coming as a part of the Final Fantasy set. This is an upcoming set that's coming in June 13, 2025. The theme is basically, for the set, Final Fantasy. It consists of all cards from the main 16 mainline games. However, this one is primarily based around the Final Fantasy X. So let's get into it. But before we do, this is a new series that I'm starting. I want to hear from you guys as to what you think. Do you like these kind of videos or not? What would you like to see in the future in them as well? So what will we cover? We're going to cover the major themes of the deck, including any major or minor themes. We're going to be going into which commander I think you should use. We're going to cover the strong cards from within the deck, any combos or synergies to kind of keep in mind, including this deck actually having an infinite combo too. How to play it, including early, mid, and late game, and how to basically close the game out. What to look for when you're mulliganing or in your opening hand, the deck's weaknesses and strengths, and then what direction to look for when you are looking to upgrade here. So going over the themes, commanders, and cards first. So a quick summary of the deck. The Counter Blitz deck is a green, white, blue deck that is based around counters. So the +1/+1 counters and other kinds of different counters. You're going to be passing these counters around. We're going to be proliferating them as well. So adding an extra one of the counters on whenever you proliferate, which is great. There's some elements of control in here too, which is great as well, because the deck is an innately a combat focused deck, because it is very much focused around those +1/+1 counters. So getting some control in there to, control your opponents, make sure their creatures aren't able to block and stuff is good. The deck aims to buff your creatures up while controlling your opponents with stun counters, essentially. Looking at the primary theme, as I said, this is going to be counters. There's a variety of different counters that the deck uses, but the main ones are the +1/+1 counters to buff up your creatures' power and toughness. You've got stun counters as well that prevents your opponent's creatures from untapping. And then you've got lore counters, which I'll explain in a minute because that's a part of one of the secondary themes too. However, they are a huge kind of part of just, the general theme as well. There's a lot of synergies within counters as well, helping them form a very strong theme. Stuff like, giving trample to your creatures that have +1/+1 counters and reach. Or, you've got hardened scales here, which is whenever one of those counters is put onto a creature, add an additional one. There's a lot of different synergies here, which works really, really well, and I really like it. So looking at some of the cards that synergize well with this main theme, you've got like Sphere Guide here that gives your creatures, +1/+1 and reach. Your creatures that have +1/+1 counters have reach and trample. That's great. You've got Damning Verdict here, which is a board wipe. However, it only board wipes creatures with no counters on them. We're going to have counters, so we don't mind doing that because it's going to potentially wipe out everyone else's board except for ours. Lulu Stern Guardian here has Proliferate, which lets us add an additional counter of each kind to whatever permanents or players we choose. And then it also has some kind of control aspects here with the stun counters. And then you've got like Gear Sage there, which is a mana dork that gets stronger. Gets stronger with, each time a creature with greater toughness or power that you control enters. Whenever you control enters, and also taps for mana based off the amount of +1/+1 counters. So these are all like little synergies that all work well with that kind of counter theme there. As for our commanders, we've got two different commanders that you can use within this precon. You've got Tida Yuna's Guardian here, who is based around moving counters. So at the beginning of combat, you're going to move a counter from one target creature you control to a second one. And then with the Cheer ability, the second part here, whenever one or more creatures you control with counters on them deal combat damage to a player. So if you manage to get one in and hit somebody with it, you're going to draw a card and then proliferate, which is great. Really great combat one. And then you've got Yuna Grand Summoner here, who's more kind of focused around one of the secondary themes, the summons. However, she does synergize still well with the kind of +1/+1 combat and, going in and swinging. So she can tap for one of any mana, any color, and then the next creature spell you cast will enter it with 2 additional +1/+1 counters on it. And then the second part here, whenever another permanent you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield. So if it's a creature, if it's a, artifact or, an enchantment, whatever, if it had any counters on it, then you're going to get to put that many counters that apply essentially get turned into +1/+1 counters on a different creature. So that's really interesting, a way to kind of, utilize different kind of counters if they're going to the graveyard anyway, kind of move them across. I call it Ozolith Light, which is kind of like another artifact that people use within counters decks, that is whenever a creature gets removed, it has counters on it, it goes on to that, and then you get to move them. This essentially does that, except it does it with all different types of counters. So looking at the two different commanders, both are really great, and I think you could essentially use either of them in the deck. Titus is kind of more aggro. He's going to be focusing more on that combat aspect where you're swinging in immediately to get that damage in, and then also kind of proliferating, buffing up your creatures slowly, while Yuna works as a great kind of mana dork to get things going, as well as some kind of counteraction for people trying to remove your creatures or other things off the battlefield. I'm going to be focusing more on Titus within this guide because I think that Titus is the commander that I would suggest more for new players. Once you upgrade this deck though, Yuna I think can easily become a much better commander once you add in ways to potentially like untap her and stuff. So looking at the secondary themes, there's 3 different ones in my opinion. So there's sagas. So there's a number of different saga creatures. These are essentially creatures that I'll show you some examples in a bit, but they're creatures that come in, but they're sagas as well. So they slowly tick down in lore counters. And once they get to those full lore counters, then they sacrifice themselves. Notably, they do go to the graveyard. So that's important. And that's why it works really well with Yuna. You got proliferation. So a number of different ways to proliferate counters up. That's, part of within counters, but it's kind of like a separate aspect of it as well. And then control, which is technically a counter like with the stun counters, but there is a number of other things that have some great kind of removal or counteraction for like different creatures, like removal and stuff with exiling creatures and stuff. So looking at the sagas, some sub-theme here are some of the different kind of things that you can synergize well with. You've got these guys here, which are the summons, which work really well with Yuna. So these are enchantment creatures, but they're also sagas. So they'll go, when they enter the battlefield, you'll do the first thing. So it's easier to show you on this one. You'll do the first thing here when they enter the battlefield. Then turn 2, you'll do this. Turn 3, you'll do this. And then turn 4, you'll do it again. However, after turn 4, when it gets to that 4th lore counter on it, then you will sacrifice it. However, there's great ways to kind of counteract going about this. You could remove these counters with someone like Oka, Traveling Merchant here, or Sin comes in. Sin is amazing with these sagas because when Sin comes in, he will remove all counters from any number of artifacts, creatures, and enchantments that you choose. So you can remove all of the counters off of these summons, and then they will just essentially reset back to turn 1. Next turn, after your draw step, you'll put the first lore counter back onto it, and then you'll just do whatever is at the start again. It's really great. Sin is insane with these. Really, really great. Next, we've got the proliferation sub-theme. So there's a number of different ways to kind of proliferate in here with like Inexorable Tide there. You got Grateful Apparition. Titus works best with the proliferation stuff. Tromol here synergizes as well with it. But Riku as well. Riku works really well with the proliferation because she has whenever one or more counters are put onto a creature until end of turn, that creature can't be blocked. When you proliferate, you are technically adding one more counter to each of them. So when you proliferate, you're going to make your whole your whole team, your whole amount of creatures just unblockable. It's actually really bonkers, and it's a great way to kind of do it, as well as the fact that she can steal counters, which is really funny. And then you've got that control sub theme. So like the summons, put like this summon here, summon Velethor, putting out the stun counters. You got Generous Patron here, Generous Patron, which is whenever you put one or more counters on a creature you don't control, draw a card. So if you put these stun counters on them, then technically you get to draw a card. Great synergy there. You've got Auron here with when you attack, put a +1 counter on him, and then you get to exile something until he leaves the battlefield. Kimara here taps something down whenever at the beginning of combat, Kimara is going to tap something, and then you get to bypass an attack then. He actually turns into it as well, which is really cool. So you got like the few kind of control-y sub-themes in here too. So going into the strong cards here, These are the ones that I consider the strong cards within the deck. Resourceful Defense is amazing because it means that any counters that are on that on a creature, if it gets removed, you can move those onto a different permanent that you control. You can also actually move them just by paying 5, which really works well with the lore counters. Move them off of one of your sagas, and boom, now it's going to start back from 0, and you can move those lore counters onto whatever creature you like, or whatever permanent. You can move it onto a land if you really wanted to. You've got Sin Unending Cataclysm. It's great because you get to remove all those counters, and that you can remove counters off enemy things with this, right? Any opponent's things as well. So you come in, you remove all the counters off everyone's stuff, and then he gets twice that amount of counters that you removed in +1/+1 counters. Insane. Protection magic, I really like this, putting a shield counter on creatures, which means that the next time that creature would get destroyed, instead you're going to remove the shield counter from it, or if that would be dealt damage. Unit's Decision, sacrifice a creature. If you do, draw a card, and then you get to put out a creature from your hand or a land from your hand onto the battlefield. You got Una. I think that Una alone is just a crazy great card. Luminous Broodmoth. If a creature dies without flying, it returns to the battlefield with a flying counter on it. And then you can proliferate that and move that flying counter around if you wanted with like Titus. Damning Verdict. Crazy great board wipe. The Summon Yojimbo is really cool because you get to exile something when it comes in. So you got that like control aspect there. And then the second and third thing gives you like a pseudo... similar kind of ghostly prison effect, where if a creature is going to attack you, whoever's attacking you, they have to pay 2 extra mana for each creature that's coming in to attack you. And then you get to create some treasures too down there. So looking at combos and synergies to watch out for. As I said about the Saga creatures, there are some great things with the Saga creatures that work incredibly well. You can remove the counters with Ochre. Titus as well allows you to move the counters there too. So Ochre removes them to draw cards. Titus, you could just move them to whatever you wanted. The Sin, as I said, kind of removes all of those lore counters, and then boom, they get to start back from 0. And Luminous Broodmoth works with most of them. I think there's 4 of them in the deck, but he works with 3 of them because one of them does have flying, which means that when, you get down to here, you put the third one on, technically this thing dies, goes to the graveyard, but then because it was a creature that died, it comes back with a flying counter on it, and then you get to do it all over again. So some really great kind of synergies with these Saga creatures there. You've got these guys here as well. So Una's Decision makes you sacrifice a creature. If you do draw a card, you can use stuff like Luminous Broodmoth here. So if you sacrifice a creature without flying, boom, it gets to come back, because technically, even if you sacrifice it, it is still dying. Together Forever does the very similar thing. If it would die, instead it comes to your hand. Sorry, when it dies, so it does technically die, goes to the graveyard, and then can return to your hand, which is great, right? Like, just allow you to bypass the actual downside of this card just by paying 1 or just having this creature out, which is good. As for like the proliferation here, works really well with hardened scales, because now whenever you proliferate, you're putting 2 +1/+1s on things because of hardened scales. And then Sin Unending Cataclysm, you could start your turn, cast, a couple cheap spells or something like that to proliferate things up, and then you proliferate your opponent's things as well. Then you play Sin, come in, steal all those +1s that you proliferated from opponent's things, and boom, you've got a really, really big Sin that you can swing into people. And as I said, there isn't actually an infinite combo within this deck as well. So all you need to do is cast Gata and Luzu, and then when it enters, you target the Walking Ballista. So that means that when Walking Ballista now takes damage this turn, you prevent that damage and instead put that many +1/+1 counters on it. You do need to have hardened scales or some other multiplier for your +1/+1 counters in the deck. However, on the board at the time, this means that you will use Walking Ballista. You will remove a counter from it, dealing 2 damage to it, right? Sorry, 1 damage to it. However, when it is prevented, you will then put a +1 counter on it. And then Hardened Scales turns that into 2 +1 counters. So now for the price of 1 +1/+1 counter, you have 2 +1/+1 counters. And you can see how that goes infinite. So you get infinite +1 counters onto your Walking Ballista. Then you just remove them all and destroy everyone. Crazy great. I'm surprised they put an infinite combo into this deck, but realistically I'm not, because Walking Ballista is in here, and Walking Ballista goes infinite so easily. Another one that you can do is Endless Detour and Yuna's Whistle. If you cast your Endless Detour, returning a creature that you've got out that's going to die or something, or a creature that's in your graveyard to the top of your deck, you can then use Yuna's Whistle to reveal that creature and immediately put the +1 counters onto something from the second part. Whenever you reveal the creature, put X +1/+1 counters on the target creature. So you could find, like, your Sin, which has like, what, 7 mana? I think he costs 7 mana. And then you allow that to put 7 +1/+1 counters on a creature. It's actually pretty bonkers with that. You've also got like Promise of Loyalty. You can use that to board wipe, and then all of those +1 counters will then be able to go onto whatever creature you chose as your vow creature. So, if you've got a big flyer, you could put them all on that. Either Yuna or Resourceful Defense will work with this, just as a, hey, I board wiped everything. I have this one creature left, and my creature now has, 60 +1/+1 counters on it. Good luck. Now, if you guys are liking this content, make sure you leave a comment down below. Make sure you let me know, and make sure you subscribe as well, because I cover the news before anyone else in the Magic space. Just, instant speed, breaking news. As soon as things come out, we're covering it here. And I plan on doing a whole series of these. And if people like them, then I can do them for every set going forward as well. So how to actually play. The opening hand or mulliganing. Ideally, you want to aim towards having 3 lands in hand, in my opinion, with this deck. Try to aim to have at least one way to make green, white, and blue mana. You also want 1 or 2 forms of ramp. I would probably aim for 2 forms of ramp, in my opinion, just because I like kind of ramping out faster, but 1 will work as well. And it depends on what they are too. Like if you've got like a Soul Ring, then that becomes, 1 is fine. So these forms of ramp will either be mana rocks, so that's going to be your Soul Ring or your Arcane Signet. You've got a couple creatures in there that can tap for mana with a Gear Sage and the Incubation Druid, I think it is. And then you've got sorceries that allow you to search for lands as well, like the Farseek kind of things. You also want 2 or 3 creatures, and you also want ways to start getting your counters up as soon as possible. Hardened Scales is definitely one that you're going to be looking for. It is a great card. Stuff like Breed for the Hunt is good too, so that way you've got ways to be able to take advantage of the counters and get card draw 2 going. You just want to have a few synergistic things with your counters to kind of get them going. Depending on what you're versing, like who you're going up against as your opponents, you may want removal as well, just to make sure that you've got that. Like whether it's a counter spell or selective, like single target removal, it's always a good idea to potentially have those, just to make sure that you can get through to the mid game, which I think is where this deck's really going to shine. So this is an example of a hand that I would probably keep. You've got like 3 lands here, 2 forests and an idyllic beachfront. I would play idyllic beachfront first, potentially, depending on what I drew, but getting Hardened Scales out early is not too bad either. It's just the issue with the idyllic beachfront is that it does enter tapped. You also have Duskshell Crawler in here, which kind of buffs up our creatures with +1/+1 counters to have trample, which is good. We've got a counter in here as well. This Endless Detour technically can count as a counter spell. And then you've got like Auron over here as like a removal too. So this hand I think is pretty decent, and I would probably keep that because we've got a little bit of everything. We've got some creatures in here. We've got like a removal-ish spell. We've got a way to start getting our +1 counters out. It's good. So our aim for the early game is to start building up our resources as fast as possible and swinging in for chip damage with our creatures as well. Ramping up as much mana as we can have available faster than our opponents with our mana dorks and with our ramp spells. So, our, as I said, Farseek, 3 visits, that kind of stuff. You also want to build up your enchantments. So, your Hardened Scales things, stuff like that. You've got like the Sphere Grid in here as well, which is good. Like the Together Forever as well is great. Like, just having those enchantments that you potentially want for various different aspects. Getting creatures out that can attack too, and ones that support our game plan is going to be important. Ideally, you want to get Titus out after you have the counters set up. Titus himself does not do counters. He does not put any +1/+1 counters on anything. So we really need to have those +1 counters out already, and then start swinging in to proliferate and get them going faster. Selectively remove any creatures that will allow your opponents to keep up with you as well, or any enchantments or anything that's kind of getting them ahead. get rid of them. Just kind of don't be hesitant to, in my opinion, because this deck is going to be like, you know, wanting to go fast. We're not going to win in the early game, but as soon as it gets to mid game, we want to start swinging in for lethal damage as soon as possible. So moving into the middle game, you know, you want to have Titus out for sure. We want to start closing the game as fast as possible once he is out. Start getting as many +1/+1 counters onto your creatures as possible to swing in for big damage, using the stun counters to get rid of any annoying blockers, anything with like, you know, Death Touch, anything like that, any huge creatures that they get out. You want to get those big summons out as well, and then you want to make sure that you're extending them for as long as possible. I showed you a few ways to go about that earlier on with the different synergies there. Just getting rid of the counters on them or moving the counters with like Titus off of them and stuff is just easy way to get going. You've also got just outgrowing your opponent's boards as fast as possible is what we want to do. Getting those counters going really big, getting big creatures. Now, the other thing you need to make sure you do is don't swing in with all your creatures and leave yourself vulnerable. This deck doesn't really have any ways to make like vigilance creatures or anything like that. Once you swing, those creatures are, you know, going to be tapped. You're going to potentially take some splashback damage there. There is a couple vigilance creatures in there, but not many. So just kind of keep that in mind, that if you do swing in with your creatures, you could potentially leave yourself vulnerable. Just like, you know, make sure that you don't leave yourself too vulnerable. So assembling a win, how are we going to win this? We're going to win via combat damage or potentially commander damage. If we swing in with Titus, we could potentially win with combat damage if we've, you know, buffed him up enough. Once your board is big enough, you can use Damning Verdict to board wipe and close out with combat, because now opponents may not have creatures and you can just swing in and just take them out. There's a few trample enablers in here as well, which helps get rid of any chump blockers. And Riku also makes it so that your creatures can't be blocked if they have got a counter on them that turn, which is great. The aim is to just get a fair few creatures out, start proliferating up your counters to get big enough to just swing in and destroy people. There's a few creatures in here with flying, which makes it easier. Whether it's, you know, the Broodmoth giving flying or just big creatures with flying. Your counters will also just constantly move around. So if a creature has counters on it, that gets removed. It can move those counters to a different creature. So you can maintain a strong board presence with blockers or just to be able to swing in to destroy people. So how does it stack up? The strengths of this deck are really in the early mid game, in my opinion. There's strong early game with creatures that just grow very quickly. You've got some nice protection pieces for your creatures and counters to just kind of feel sticky and like the counters just stick around for a while. And a few nice ramp pieces. There's also nice card draw in here as well, which was something that I was really impressed by. Whether it's Titus himself that does card draw or, you know, Bread for the Hunt does card draw. You've got Inspiring Call as well for card draw. There's just a few different nice card draw cards. The weaknesses here is just relying on combat to win, which isn't always viable. There's going to be times where you're not able to swing at people. There's times where people may have, you know, Death Touch blockers, or they just have big creatures, or, you know, they just have stacks pieces that make it so you're not able to swing in with them. So that's just the kind of thing that kind of slows this deck down and makes it harder for you to be able to win. There's not much removal in this deck besides, you know, board wipes. There's some single target creature removal, but just not a huge amount in my opinion. Mostly like creatures is fine, but it's the non-creature removal that is more lacking. Getting rid of, like, you know, the enchantments that are making it so you can't attack people and stuff is where I would kind of start looking. Stuff like Generous Gift adding in there would be good, just to make sure that you're able to remove those annoying artifacts or enchantments that may stop you being able to swing in. It's very vulnerable to board wipes as well, especially like exile based ones. So there's a couple counter spells in here, which is great, but overall, you know, just getting board wiped is really going to set you back, because then your +1 counters don't have anywhere to go. Like, you know, you can move them to a non-creature with resourceful defense. It just can move them to any permanent. So you can technically sit them on like a land and kind of build it up on a land and then move them once you get a creature back out. But still, it's not great. And the mana base is definitely less than optimal. There is a lot of room to be improved with that mana base. So how to begin upgrading? More counter multipliers would be huge. Stuff that adds additional counters when things get counters on them is great. More protection as well. Stuff like Mutational Advantage in here gives all your creatures with hexproof and indestructible if they have counters, and then prevents all damage to them, and then also proliferates. It's actually a crazy card. Other non+1/+1 counters to pass around as well. So stuff like Arwen that gives indestructible counters is great because then you can proliferate them, you can move them around with Titus, and then she also gives lifelink counters. That's good. Pass around more counters and stuff. Ways to get vigilance onto your creatures as well. More +1/+1 counter synergies like Herald of the Secret Stream, so then you can swing in, you're not getting blocked. Some better removal pieces and better lands. I'm not doing a actual upgrade guide in this video. However, I just wanted to kind of give you the ways that I would look at upgrading it. Things that I would cut would be some of those weaker creatures that aren't doing much for the game plan, whether they're more expensive ones or whether they were ones that I thought were just not doing enough for the board, like enough for the game. Like for example, the Sunscorch region is good, but I just don't think it does enough, and it's quite slow. The tapped lands, so any lands that are coming in tapped, I would look at removing them and replacing them with a better option. And then weaker removal pieces as well. Like there's a couple removal pieces in here that just aren't that great, like Destroy Evil. Destroy Evil I just don't think is great, and I think you could remove it and add some better removal pieces with it. Now, if you are looking to go into the other themes, you've got like the Saga theme with Yuna you could easily go into. There's more summons that you can add in here, like the Summon Fenrir. Freed from the Real is definitely great because you've got Yuna there. You definitely want to kind of make it so you can untap Yuna and just keep, untapping her and go infinite like that really easily and then get huge creatures out. Some more recursion as well because of the fact that you are relying on Sagas and Saga creatures. Eventually, they could potentially end up in the graveyard, so recurring them would be good. And then you've got Saga synergies in like Ian Chesterton here that allows you to be able to replicate all of your Sagas. Boom, now you've got 2 copies of a Summon Fenrir, which is just going to be great. It lets you ramp out twice as well. And then you get, that would be really cool. There's some really great things that you can potentially do there. As for if you wanted to go the proliferation route here, ways to add poison to people would be huge. Just getting in poison and then proliferating, etc. Titus would be a very interesting commander for like a poison based deck because of the fact that he is based around swinging in and dealing combat damage and stuff. So adding in more stuff to get poison out and then more ways to proliferate as well would be huge. And then I also think that more ways to deter attackers is a good idea because proliferation is kind of a slower mechanic. Like if you wanted to go for like the poison win and stuff like that, some of the cards are kind of getting more expensive and stuff to be able to proliferate. It just takes a little bit longer to kind of get online, I think. So getting more ways to deter attackers, I think, is a good idea. And then you can kind of build it up with the proliferation and kind of get up there crazier. So in conclusion and summary, the Counter Blitz deck is just a very straightforward counters-based deck. The Counter Blitz is a very straightforward counters-based deck. It is built around combat. You're typically going to win via combat, and after buffing your creatures up with huge kind of +1/+1 counters and swinging in. It's a strong early game, but you potentially fold to too much removal. You want to get that win around that kind of late early game, start of mid game. So you're looking at, once you kind of get Titus out, starting to try and close out as fast as possible. You want to aim to build your engine as fast as possible and start swinging in quickly. So let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know what you thought of this video. I hope you guys had a wonderful day and goodbye.